just to introduce our speakers, John has been a fully qualified architect for the past 17 years, and his work includes a number of residences, fine dining restaurants, and luxury resorts all over the world. He's won multiple international design competitions. His work has been featured on the BBC, and he's recently been included in the under-40s group of the Power List in London. Sophie has a background in the art world and draws inspiration from both past and present sources, from antiques to cutting-edge design. This informs a layered aesthetic which merges styles from different eras. Her French background underpins all her work, and she's often found trawling through antique markets in Paris, where her parents are based. Understanding how clients live is a key part of the design process and is the starting point for every Kitesgrove project. Joa has worked with Farrow for over 20 years, developing the colour range and consulting on design projects. Believe it or not, she consults on over 4,500 rooms every year. Much of Joa's work involves helping people see how Farrow paints can work together to create a truly decorated feel. Working with the paints and papers every day, she has a wealth of experience on both residential and commercial projects. Her passion for design and colour means her own home is under constant renovation, and she claims to redecorate her own home once a week. So, Joa, without further ado, what does home and a sense of well-being actually mean to you?
I think for me, if we're talking about well-being, we should celebrate our differences, really, because our homes are our sanctuaries, and we are sort of very much individuals. And that's when I'm creating paint colours, I try to create a really broad palette, so there's something for everybody, be them country, town, young, old, traditional, contemporary. So I think well-being is about oneself in many, many ways, the way we do it in our homes.
And John, would you agree with that?
Yes, wow, that's a bit loud. From a slightly different angle, but with a very similar theme. My take on well-being begins with the individual, and an often unspoken question, but which underlies many other questions of what is the best version of that person and how can they achieve that. And I think that my role as an architect is to try and tease that out. So within the home and within working with interior designers, to sort of set the scene for that to happen, because I think with interior design you often are more intimately involved.
And Sophie, what does well-being, a sense of home, mean to you?
I like the word sanctuary as well. I'm right there with you, Joa. And on that note, I have a thing for language, and being French, there isn't actually an equivalent for the word home in French. It's roughly translated as chez soi, which is at yours, which I think sums up this sense of it's no one else's, it's yours, and it's your own experience. So your home is a true reflection of yourself, really, and a sanctuary for you to retreat to.
So, Sophie, can you give us some examples on how your interiors engage the senses to help boost this emotional health and well-being?
I think, drawing on what I just said, home is also where we start our day and end our day. So it stands to reason that a sense of comfort should be prioritized throughout those things. I can't think of a greater influence on our continuous existence than where we begin and end our days. So on a kind of interior decoration level, we will think very carefully about bed linen. I don't know anyone who doesn't love getting into a crisp, newly cleaned sheets, and likewise waking up there in the morning. So if that's where you're starting your day and ending your day, then it's a wonderful influence. On an interior architectural level, drawing on natural light is of huge importance to our human responses, I think. So we will think carefully about natural light, drawing on that, and colour palette that will enhance those things. And finishes as well. So careful selection of finishes, such as carpet, rugs, placement of timber flooring or tiles, can inform how sound transfers from space to space. Likewise, if you're living in an apartment, sound transfer up and down, you don't really want to be reminded that there's people living so close to you in such proximity. So we think very carefully about those finishes to make sure that your own experience within your own space is enhanced and optimized as much as possible.
So essentially, you're saying that all the senses come into play.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's the sound, yeah. And John, you quite rightly point out that health and well-being are intrinsically linked. Do you believe that architecture can improve our health?
The short answer is yes. And to follow on from what Sophie was talking about, I think that begins in the way that we analyse that and the way that we address that is through the senses. It's through the ways that we encounter that architecture. And if you work from the outside in, first of all, the way that your building relates to its immediate environment is absolutely key. That might be a natural environment and how it relates to the position of the sun, how it relates to maybe the position of the street and how you approach that home off the street. But then also working from the inside out. Again, looking at the senses, if you just think about how you encounter that building, how do you interact with that building? Natural light, again, it's going to come up over and over, I'm sure. But I think that when you think of your perception of a space and your sense of comfort, security, and enjoyment of that space, I think natural light is absolutely key. The aromas in that space are absolutely key. The textures, the spaces that you touch, the story of the space as you walk through it. I don't think you're quite going to get around to tasting a space, but you are conscious of so many aspects of that space without actually, addressing them directly. So I think that your senses and your interaction with that space through that senses are key.
And Joa, looking at colour, how can we use colour to lift our mood?
I'm not sure if you can use it to lift your mood, but you can certainly, I think, work with colour to work with it to create the atmosphere that you want. And actually what John was saying is this sort of link through the house is something that I've always been very obsessed with. And it's a great, great time to be talking about colour because there's been a seismic shift in the way we are using colour in the home. And we're suddenly possibly going away from the grey mania. Do you agree? Although, right, look, at this moment, here's an image of a very grey house. And the reason I've put that there is because, actually, what's fantastic about it is that it's in Manhattan, and it really kind of reflects not only the people who live in it, but also the sort of vernacular of the city. And but the thing about going away from grey, I think, is because right now, when the world's in a little bit of a muddle, we want to go back to be comforted by colour. We want nostalgia. We want to sort of go back to basics. And actually, colour is quite a sort of basic thing. And also, I just love using things like gloss, which gloss, for lots of people, we kind of equate it with glamour, but it's not about glamour. It's a very basic, original paint finish, and my personal obsession is putting it on ceilings, where perhaps, I'm not sure if any of you are old enough, but you know it used to go on pubs, on the ceilings in pubs, so you could wipe it down. And that creates an absolutely extraordinary atmosphere in a room, and that certainly sort of changes your mood.
Yes,
and I firmly believe that we are going away from grey. So I have, in the last palette of new colours, we created colours which are bringing on the renaissance of much earthier tones, basically, much warmer tones which are sort of uplifting in many ways. And there was one particular one called Jitney, which is a neutral, which is named after the bus that takes you from New York to the Hamptons at the end of the week. And that is exactly what we're trying to achieve with that colour, that feeling of, oh my God, the week's over and I'm going home and my home is going to give me a great big hug. And that's really what I've been trying to achieve at the moment.
And we're entering a new season now. So how can we use light and the shifting of the seasons to sort of,
as John said, light is absolutely key, both to buildings and very particularly to colour. And people kind of get a bit kind of weird about sampling colour in the house because they think it's a very boring thing to do. But actually, sampling is caring, because if you've got a very heavily pigmented paint and you're putting it into a space, you have got to see how it reacts to different light conditions, and that's what makes it alive. It's what makes it fantastic, and the fact that it will change all the time. And if there's one thing I know, I'm not sure if you two will agree, but is if you have a small dark room and you paint it white, you'll end up with a small dark dull room. It just does not work. You're much better off embracing light, embracing nature, working with it. So smaller, darker spaces, personally, I would paint them darker. Big light spaces, why paint them dark? You're just, messing with nature. Embrace what you have and keep those really, really light. And one of the things I think people were obsessed with is flow through a house. And I'm not so obsessed with that. I think flow usually means grey on grey on grey on grey. And actually, I think if we just get harmonious colours and create different moods in different spaces, it's a much nicer way to live, basically.
And carrying on the topic of nature, Sophie, how do you draw on nature in your projects, and how significant do you think this is in promoting your clients' sense of well-being?
So actually, elaborating on your point, Joa, I know this is one of your tricks too. At Kitesgrove, we like to paint or finish the staircases, hallways, what tend to be darker spaces within properties, in a much deeper tone, so that any adjoining room feels much brighter, more invigorating as a consequence. Again, that enhances the natural light that would be drawn on in those rooms, and makes you, I think it enhances that journey from space to space. It's a thoroughfare. You don't necessarily spend time there, but it creates a story as you navigate through your space.
And it feels like if you've done something with your hall, a bolder colour or even a wallpaper, you've kind of decorated your house. It gives you license to go be really neutral in all the other rooms.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it will give that space more of an identity. But actually, to your point, working with nature, working with the seasons to create perhaps a more neutral palette in those larger spaces, and then adapt them as seasons go on. It's quite a French thing to do within design. Mix it up with changing artwork, changing cushions, changing throws, and adapting it through the various different seasons can reinvigorate a space and in turn make you feel connected to the changing of time and passage of time, as it were. We work a lot with natural materials, always prioritizing as much as possible 100% materials, finishes and fabrics. Not only is it better for the environment and production, but it feels better, and obviously a space that feels better in a tangible way as well as aesthetically is going to make you feel good. And we draw a lot on the natural palettes as well. So again, I think there's no substitute for drawing on nature as a inspiration for colour palettes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the enduring use of green, I mean, it sounds so corny and obvious, but actually green makes us feel very protected. It is the colour of nature. And pink, still going on, people using pink, because pink makes us feel good about ourselves. It makes us, it is that sort of thing, giving you a great big hug, basically.
And John, can we achieve a sense of well-being through spatial design? Can you give us some examples, if so?
Yes, I mean, when I think of spaces that give you a sense of well-being, I think you can start with very simple examples, such as if you're in your house, what's a favorite spot in your house? Where do you feel most comfortable? And that's a very simple and basic question. You can then expand out to an example like a resort. And if you go on holiday in a resort, the business of that resort is to deliver a very extreme sense of well-being. And how do they manage to do that? I think, first of all, that space gives you a sense of escape. So when you're thinking of your own home, there is that possibility that where you can have a sense of escape from the stresses of the outside world. It also simultaneously gives you a sense of security because you have a community. It does have a boundary. So that is a sort of paradoxical set of briefing requirements. But if you have a sense of openness, but also a sense of security, those two requirements can sort of lead to you having a greater sense of well-being. But there are more intangible things also, which are not sort of very specifically architectural, but do come out in architectural ways. And that is, for example, just to go back again to the example of a resort, having a sense of community. I think that in a resort, you have a sense of community where you have your individual spaces, but you also have the opportunity for community activity. So in your home, can you provide the sense of saying, well, yes, this home delivers the rooms and the spaces and the environments and the settings for you to have very private events, but also in ways to invite others in, both in a more private way at a dinner party, or even in the sense of a semi-public way in your garden, where you have a sense of security, but you're also quite welcoming to the immediate neighborhood. And I think that the reason that we have the reason I've sort of dropped in a community building image in there is that I think that also a client's goal when they're building a home, I think that it begins with a sense of optimism. I think that every project begins with optimism, even though it might sort of descend into other sort of descriptions. But I think that we have to capture that optimism. And, in the self-build project, there is sort of this community and there's building. And I think that a self-build project allows a community not only to have optimism, but to directly have agency in making that optimism real and literally physically building that space. So when you are designing that home with your client, I think that involving them, giving your client themselves agency in actually creating that space, delivers that sense of saying, well, I own it. It's also, you're giving them a sense of ownership in the project itself.
I don't know if you two agree, but I mean, my thing is often, if I'm putting colours in people's houses, is the fact that you do that where during the day you want to be in a big light space, and in the evening you want to retire to a much cosier, more dramatic dark space, again using light. But it is that sort of ownership thing, that when I'm on my own with my husband, my family, I just want to be in this small, darker, much more intimate space, but during the day I want to be in a big light space.
And in that sort of vein of thinking, I think if you look at the quality of light in an office, I think the temperature of the light usually is very different to the sort of intimate temperatures that you get at home. I mean, there are different kinds of offices, of course, but I think in the end, it's the way in which light, both natural and artificial, then interacts with color and interacts with your perception of that space, sort of contributes to your feeling in that space. So if you have a sort of a cold, more sort of active, more stay awake, drink the coffee kind of light, versus a warmer, more intimate, often with the darker colors or more intimate, warmer colors at home, then these two types of approaches contribute to your different contrasting emotions in those two different kinds of spaces.
Joe, we've touched on this about nature, but how can we really connect our interiors with the exterior?
Oh, well, on a very basic level, the best way to do it is to paint your window frames or your garden door frames in the same colour as the walls. It sounds so basic. But there are 3 basic ways of decorating which people never, ever think about. And the first is when you put colour on the wall and a white, quite often a bright white, or if you're my mother, a bright gloss white on the woodwork. And that makes, although it appears to be the traditional way of decorating, it actually makes for very uncomfortable spaces, because why do you want to be looking at little bits of skirting, door frames, picture rails? They're little bits of dowel. They're for some reason we've made them decorative over the years, but they're not decorative in any way. So if you paint everything one colour, the room will feel bigger. You'll get much more connection with your exterior because you haven't got to read a barrier of that frame to look through. So that's a sort of simple way. The other way of decorating, of course, is to do lighter walls and darker woodwork, and that will make your spaces feel bigger and lighter. It's very obvious you're putting the lightest colour on the biggest surface, and I think that really creates a sense of well-being, actually, because it feels like somehow the trim is sort of nurturing you in some way. And then, one colour on everything is huge historic precedent for it, but it's very, very popular at the moment because I think it creates rooms which feel really strong but calm at the same time. And one of the things,
one colour on the ceiling,
well,
and the wall.
It can go over the ceiling. I think I've put in a couple of examples here where we've either put gloss on the ceiling of the same colour, which is pretty kind of outrageous. And actually, if you peek your heads into the VIP room here, you'll see we've done a really audacious gloss ceiling. You were slightly shocked by Sophie, weren't you? Oh, here we've got gloss on the ceiling, yeah. And on the hall, that's the same colour, but two different finishes, using gloss on the bottom and flat emulsion on the top, just to create a kind of visual effect. And here, this kitchen is one of my big things at the moment, to make rooms feel less kitcheny, because we kind of live in them, kitchens, don't we, most of the time, is if you paint your units the same colour as your walls, they disappear. And that's, I think it's something, creates a room which is much nicer to live in, actually.
Sophie, can you tell us a bit about balance and imperfection in the context of your interiors?
Bit of an oxymoron, really. But I think where that question drives is that we need a good harmony of the two. So especially living in cities, we're constantly bombarded by visual information and visual clutter. So it feels as though our homes should restore balance. And with that, a clever arrangement, we think carefully about layout, interior layout, and simple things like clever storage solutions so that you avoid visual clutter and that sense of stress being absorbed into your subconscious, which will in turn calm you. If everything has a place, then you're not constantly flying around trying to find that thing that you've lost because you're also running late, and we've all been there. So we think carefully about storage solutions to try and counter that. Equally, I think in terms of paint colours, in terms of palettes, balance is really integral, and it sort of draws on what you were just mentioning, Joa. You can create intelligent contrasts that create interest, but overall an environment that feels harmonious within its sort of push and pull of tonal palette will create greater calm. And it, especially in large spaces where they tend to be full of more furniture, more accessories, if that's going to become visually cluttered, and such as this image that's just shown on the left, if there's a lot of furniture within the space, you'd probably rather go for a calmer backdrop and stage to that environment. And then in contrast, I think that a good dose of balance needs to be sort of turned upside down at times. So we like to celebrate imperfection and draw on the quirks and imperfections within particularly natural materials. There are no straight lines in nature, and as human beings, I think we yearn for those more analog experiences and human reactions to our environment.
Organic forms.
Exactly, yeah. So a good balance of the two, but I think trying to achieve a harmony in our environments is really key.
So, John, I suppose the big question here is well-being actually measurable, and can we make it into a design system? As we've touched on, well-being is so personal. How do you incorporate it into your designs?
I'm going to latch on to the word harmony, which I think is a very powerful word. It's something that is ultimately intangible, but many, many have tried over the years and over the centuries to make that tangible and make that into something that can be measured. And I think that if you think of an example, sort of geomancy, feng shui, which has to do with harmony with your environment, or you think of the Renaissance architects who used geometry with slightly different priorities, but they also had to do with harmony, had to do with visual harmony. And that came into the 20th century, where architects believed that visual harmony could lead to social harmony in very, very broad terms. But now we deal, if you think what we deal with now, we deal with quite, I guess you could say, as an architect, quite dry things like planning law. And planning law has its roots in seeking harmony. and in seeking harmony on a sort of neighborhood level, and seeking harmony on a sort of building level. You don't want to have, if you're going to propose to have a school next to a house with people, honking their horns every morning at 8:25, that is dealt with in planning. And that has to do with harmony. It contributes to your lack of well-being or well-being. So I think that there are systems which seek to measure it and which seek to make it tangible. I'm not sure that in the end you can actually define it into one thing, because as Joa was saying earlier, well-being begins with your individual preferences and your individual happiness, your individual sense of having that well-being, and that will change over time. That will change from culture to culture, and so you can get close, and it's one of those things that you'll never quite put down on paper because it will be immediately out of date.
So when you start a project, do you get to know your client quite well to work out how they live and how their house will?
Yes, I think that the goal in the end is just to go back to this phrase that I said at the very beginning, which is that client wanting to be the best version of themselves. And when we're working on our projects, we want to think, well, how can we make that real? And what do you want to achieve in each space? What do you want to achieve with the project as a whole? And I think the whole process of getting to that stage of actually designing that building is really sort of getting down to the nuts and bolts of what that question is and how that question is answered for the client.
Sophie, a few of your images have been scrolling here, and they're very quiet and calm spaces. How do you achieve this, despite working across such varied styles?
They are two words that keep recurring in descriptions of Kitesgrove projects. It's true. I think I come back to this sense of balance that answers the previous question. For me, it's really important when designing a space that there's no one item is fighting with the other, if you like. So there should be a good balance of layered textures and pattern, and I'm all for adding a lot of those items and decorative language, but it feels as though as a whole no one item or one colour should be shouting louder than the other. I think in terms of quiet and calm, again, we're so bombarded constantly in the outside world, and we draw that bombardment and assault, as you described it as well when we were speaking a bit earlier, into our living environments through our phones and through our digital world. So actually, I feel like our homes should represent a visual piece, whatever that means to the individual.
And grounding. I think that was one of the things we discussed. And you can do things which are grounding with colour by for instance, like it's very corny, but the kitchen island, low down, dark, central. It somehow sort of feels like it's pulling us, grounding us. Or as you said about the spindles of a staircase, if you do it dark, it feels like a dark core running through the house. And I think that gives you a sense of well-being, doesn't it?
I think again it's to do with this balancing of, as you transition through your various spaces, there's a sense of narrative, but you feel as though there's not one space that is greater than the other, if you like.
And of course, I mean, that's why I love to do a dark hall with, because most people come in their houses and they come into the hall and they just go straight to the kitchen. That's sort of the way we use our houses. And I think if you have a stronger colour in the hall and a lighter colour in the kitchen, it sort of feels like you're a moth to a flame. You're being drawn through into that light, which is a lovely way to live.
Which is also at the core of comfort. So, and comfort is what we prioritise in the projects that we design. Ultimately, feeling comfortable is what makes you feel good. So, whatever that means to you as an individual within your property. But I think there are threads that connect us as human beings, and that's again drawing on the senses. Touch and sight and comfort are pretty experiences that we all can draw on from the textures that we use, the materials that we layer throughout our projects. And I think drawing on your hug point, I like, Joa. I think for our spaces to give us a big hug.
We want a hug, don't we? When we, I mean, right now we certainly do. I think, you know, with all that's going on in the world. And also, actually, I think that one of the things which I try to do, even if you want that sense of calm, is to sort of, or what John was saying about stimulating the senses. And you can do little things to make you smile. Especially, I love with children, very often, well, over the last 5 years, and you're decorating a house in West London, they would only use grey. And I feel very sorry for those children. They had to live in this, you know, completely grey house. And so putting colours inside cupboards, it sounds like such a small thing, but actually that child gets up in the morning, opens the cupboard, makes them smile, possibly a colour they've chosen themselves, and then the mother can shut it very firmly and, you know, pretend it's not there. But it is, I think that's a sense of well-being, it's that stimulating the senses. And colours should make you smile. I think your home should make you smile as well as comfort you, don't you? Yeah.
Yeah, we like to create what we call moments within our projects. So a small bay window or a seating area that you can retreat to and read a book. Spaces, I suppose they're moments that draw you into stopping what you're doing and a sense of distraction and be more present. And in that respect, draw on mindfulness and more of a sense of the now and experiencing your space as you want to. So be it through entertainment, engaging in conversation, discussion, and enjoying being with friends and family, or actually enjoying a solitary moment just to be and to feel the space that you're kind of inhabiting. I love a library. I'm not sure anyone who wouldn't love a library, but drawing on the literary and the thought processes that come from books. We'll try and put as many books as we can into projects and encourage clients to bring books to the project as a starting point, which is a lovely way of doing it. Artwork is also another tool for thinking about nostalgia, thinking about things that connect us to ourselves and our histories, and objects that make us connect to family and things that are meaningful to us. I think there's nothing more important within our homes and our environments.
Yeah, so it's about celebrating the passage of time and how we can, you know, with antique objects and things you've collected over time, so it's not just a sterile new environment, so it's something personal. So John, work is with us all the time on our iPhones and computers, and I suppose what we all want to do is to really create a home. When planning a house, how do you tackle the balance between form and function?
Yes, well, form and function. I mean, we, from the time that we're educated as architects, you know, we are asked to address this debate between form and function. I think that it's missing a third and very critical question, and that is, how does a space make you feel? I'm listening to, you know, to two of you, and I think that, you know, when I'm also working with interior designers, I think most of my projects are in collaborations with interior designers. My role in that collaboration is to set the scene for you guys to do the kinds of things that you do and to deliver that sense of well-being through, as I say, the more intimately interacted with items that interior designers use. I mean, the interior designers are going to be, you know, the client will be sort of sleeping on your, you know, on your sheets. They'll be eating with your. So I think that
you're the most generous architect I've ever come across.
I'm not done yet. No, but I think that in setting that scene, you want to be able to make well-being likely. I think you want to make it something that becomes a natural progression of how that house comes to be. And I love the example, I love the word you used there, which was narrative, because it is a word I myself I'm obsessed with. And I think that question of how does a space make you feel is not one answer, it's a series of answers. When you come in, actually before you walk in your home, because architecturally we're working from the outside as well, but let's just say as you walk in your home, there is a story that you are telling by walking through each of your spaces. And in an ideal world, there will be a manner in which you want to feel in each of those spaces. So if the answers to how, you know, the question of how you want to feel is different in each space, absolutely sure each of those spaces will be manifested. They will look different. They will feel different. The items, the FF&E that you install will be different. But my role as an architect is really sort of to create that journey as well. I mean, when we're space planning, we're not just drawing lines on a page. We're actually imagining a progression. And I'll give you an example. I mean, I worked on a project with an interior designer recently, and I know that in her journey, there was one room which was a master bedroom, which was a very particular kind of sanctuary, and then she wanted it to feel in a very particular kind of way. And that one room led to us moving. This is a sort of Victorian terraced house, semi-detached kind of thing, and that one room led to us moving the stair, and that moving the stair in the house led to the entire house being redesigned. And that all began with a question of how do you want to feel in your master bedroom? So for me as an architect, I think that my role is to say, well, to get to that answer, to use patience, to listen, but also to use my experience, and then architecturally to deliver something, to set the scene so that the interior designers themselves can then flesh it out and make it something that the client can live with and interact with every day.
Sophie, we touched on this briefly about the passage of time. And I mentioned earlier that you're quite often in Paris looking in antique markets. Will you source...
Wish I was more.
Do you source antiques for your clients, or will you quite often work with a client's pre-existing collection and build that into homes? I mean, how important is this idea of celebrating your past and your present and obviously your future as well?
So both. I particularly love to have a starting point, so when clients... I guess this is in the context of clients who might have just bought a property and they don't have anything to bring to it. Then in that case we would source everything from scratch. But equally we work on a lot of projects where they already live there and we're refurbishing, so all sorts. But I particularly like having a starting point, and that starting point might simply be because we've been sourcing something. We've sourced something, we build on that. But when it comes to antiques, vintage items, also items of antiquity, of kind of real historical value, there's no substitute for the patina that they achieve over time, the spirit that they imbue really within a space because of the time that has passed through that object, as it were, and as a counterbalance to the sort of glorification of newness that there is nowadays. I feel like working with antiques and vintage items will create a greater sense of timelessness within a property. I don't actually like the word timeless because I don't think anything's
something
timeless.
Grounding about it, isn't it?
But I think it's grounding, and I think it's likely to age a lot less quickly, if you like. It's not going to age if it's already passed through that passage of time. So I love layering different design eras and items of furniture and artwork and objects from different design eras in order to nod to the past. But I think it's also that if we're working with a client's existing collection, those objects are imbued with nostalgia and memory for them. So they will take on a significance to that individual that I can't necessarily comprehend, but create a much more personal space. And I think a home should be a reflection of the client and them, and wrap them in that sense of themselves and family and history.
And there are certainly colours that you can use which feel much more timeless. If you take the neutrals which have a little bit of green in the background of it, the sort of original Farrow neutrals, they feel, I think the wonder of them is that when you paint them in a room, it feels like it's been that way forever. And I think we are going away from that feeling of newness. So those sort of tones, rather than the colder, greyer tones, are much more attractive to us now.
And are you seeing colours sort of going full circle, sort of going out of fashion and now coming,
absolutely. So
coming
Sophie
back
and I were discussing this morning. I mean, I keep actually being distracted by this very bright yellow slide of mine that keeps coming up. Because you were saying that your grandmother loved mustard yellow, and colours are markers in our lives, and I think that possibly then you would have an affection for a mustard yellow, And the great thing about decorating at the moment is that the gloves are off as far as rules are concerned. You can do whatever you like. So, the fact that I famously keep going on about painting your ceiling the same colour as your walls to make your ceiling height go up, very counterintuitive, I know. That's one thing, but you can, make the frames of your doors bigger, just paint them out onto the walls a little bit. There are a million things you can do, and rules are there to be broken and to create the sanctuary that you want. And I think colour is a really, really good way of doing that.
I think to your point about, we've all talked a lot about natural light, but we had a situation with a private client project a few years ago where they had a beautiful Georgian property that overlooked a wonderful garden, but it was east-facing, and selecting the paint colour for that room, which would always really be drawing on quite a cold morning light, in order for it to feel warmer, because it was a very large 5-metre high ceiling and grand reception room. In order for it to feel more enveloping and warmer, we went for a much warmer pink. I went for a pink rather than white, and than I normally would have chosen, but actually it was counterbalanced by the cool light always on the space.
You've got to think about the use of the room when it's used,
Yeah.
and which way it faces. I mean, basically, there's all those things. Exactly what John was saying, that there are so many things to think about.
But the passage of time is inherent in that, looking at the direction of the sun, looking at how a space will, how essentially the building will be affected by the different seasons is really important, because we are in constant flux and our homes are in flux with us. So creating environments that adapt in harmony and in complement to our lifestyles, but also the natural world around us. It's in a constant state of change. So being cognizant of that, I think, is really key, so that we create spaces that adapt to the use to the seasons and can be enhanced accordingly.
Thank you very much, John, Joa, and Sophie. Some really fascinating tips and an interesting insight into how we react to our domestic surroundings and how we live and how spaces can make us feel. I think we've got some time for some questions. Yeah, got a couple of minutes for some questions.
Hello. I wanted to ask if we have learned as a society anything from the ancient way of building and that we are carrying with us today, because there is a tendency to just neglect what has been done post-industrial and just move on with our scientific way of thinking. Thanks.
Okay, so yes, I think that there is always an opportunity. When you look back towards, let's just say, ancient ways of building, but you say ancient, but also ways of building that happen now in other parts of the world as well. This, I would say, broadly speaking, pre-industrial approach to construction often looks at the immediate environment. So if we think of that, I'm going to jump to the resort, but also give you that ancient building at the same time. You think of the resort, often it's a sort of a back to basics. It's a home away from home. It's a return to nature. It's sort of interacting with nature. You look at the more sort of pre-industrial ways of building, which still exist today and which we have in our own homes. But if you see, for example, bricks, or the bricks in London, sort of London stock, is coming from the ground. I think that harmony with nature is absolutely critical, and it was a natural, it was a natural result of building in a pre-industrial era. I also think that a sense of having a much more hands-on involvement in the creation of your own home, I think that was also something which, as I was trying to sort of capture in the sort of way that a client can interact with you as in creating your own home now. But I think that's also sort of a natural feature of more ancient and pre-industrial ways of building. And I think just generally speaking, the choice of materials, the colors, these would all have come from things which were existing in nature and around, and also at the same time in creating these spaces and in creating these homes, there was also more of a sort of community and sort of local level of saying, well, this is part of our story. And I think that when Sophie was talking about items and the narrative and how certain nostalgia, which I think is a really important word, these things were all sort of natural results of building in pre-industrial times, because you had to deal with what was immediately in front of you, whether that was materials, whether that was your environment, or whether that was your neighbors. So I think that if we can sort of approach that again, I think we'll get a bit closer.
Very quickly. My question is for Joa. I'm an interior designer. I always get intrigued by the names of the colors on your catalogs. And talking about well-being, what comes first? Is it the feeling that you want to pass on by that color? Is it the name, or is it the color? And then you go.
I think the colours and names are intrinsically together. Sometimes the name comes first, but usually the colour comes first, and then we think about it, what does it make you feel? So Bancher, which is, there's an image of it coming up next, I think, but it's also in the VIP lounge. That colour it felt very protective. It felt like it was doing something which you wanted to do at the end of the day. And so Bancher is a sort of tea, because we thought there was nothing more comforting than having a cup of tea. So yeah, they work together.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura.